The rain was constant in the town of Loria, a place where the sky seemed to mourn alongside the people. It wasn't just the weather that felt heavy. The air itself carried a sorrow that clung to every corner, every cobblestone, and every window. The people walked quickly, heads down, as if they were all carrying the same burden, yet they never spoke of it. In this town, silence was as much a part of the atmosphere as the rain. Elias lived in a small, cramped studio that looked out over the cobbled streets. His apartment was tucked in the heart of Loria, a place that once had been filled with life and love, but now was consumed by shadows. The studio had been his haven, the place where his art flourished before tragedy struck. His passion had once been to paint the beauty of the world, the warmth of human connection. But now his canvas was filled with emptiness, blank, white, and endless. Elias was a painter, though now his art felt like a mere echo of the joy he once felt. Before the silence there had been Ilara, his muse, his love. They had been inseparable, their bond deep and unquestionable. They had been in love, perhaps as deeply as two souls could be. But all that changed one fateful night. Ilara had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself, leaving only the memory of her smile and the echoes of her laughter. At first, Elias thought she had just gone away, perhaps to clear her mind, to take a break. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and soon months into years. No trace of her remained. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her. The world, it seemed, had swallowed her whole. He began to wonder if she had left on her own accord, if she had grown tired of him. The pain of not knowing was unbearable. He couldn't understand it. Why would she leave without a word, without a trace? They had been so in love, or so he had believed. Her absence gnawed at him, and with each passing day he found himself slipping further into a void, a space between the known and the unknown, where his mind began to unravel. Elias spent countless hours sitting in the same chair by the window, staring out into the storm. The rain beat against the glass like the world itself was crying with him. He tried to paint, to find solace in the strokes of his brush, but the canvas was a cruel reminder of his failure. His paintings had become darker, more distorted, less like the beautiful landscapes he once created. Now there were just smears of color, blues and grays, unsettling and abstract. His art no longer held meaning, much like his life. There were times when he thought he heard her voice, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in awe, his chest convinced that she was calling him. But when he would reach out, there was nothing. Nothing but the silence, the same endless silence that had consumed him since her disappearance. In the early days, Elias had been surrounded by people, friends, family, people who cared about him, but now they were all gone. They had stopped visiting long ago, unable to understand the depths of his grief. His obsession with finding Ilara had driven everyone away. He couldn't let go. He couldn't accept that she was gone, not when every part of him screamed that she was still out there somewhere. The pain of losing her had twisted his mind, leaving him with a desperate need to know what had happened. One evening, as Elias was lost in thought, staring blankly at the canvas before him, he felt a strange presence in the room. He froze, his hand still on the paintbrush, his eyes darting around the small studio. There, in the corner of the room, a figure stood, a man cloaked in black, his face obscured by the shadows. The man's presence was unsettling, like an intruder who had no place in the world yet somehow belonged. Elias blinked, unsure if he was hallucinating. The grief had begun to play tricks on his mind, but this felt different. This felt real. "You seek her." The man's voice cut through the silence, low and gravelly. "But you do not understand." Elias's heart raced, and he stood slowly, his hand trembling. "What do you know about her?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure took a step forward, and Elias instinctively took a step back. The man's eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, seemed to pierce through him. "I know more than you could ever imagine," the man said, his tone chillingly calm. "You are drowning in your own grief, Elias, but the answer you seek will only destroy you." Elias was trembling now, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. "I need to know what happened to her. Where is she? Tell me what happened." The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "You want to know the truth. But the truth is not something you can bear. You will find her, yes, but the price will be your soul." Elias shook his head, his thoughts racing. The words felt like a dark omen, but his desperation drove him forward. "Tell me who you are. What do you know?" The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "I am the one who understands love's true power. It is not something to be cherished, not something to be desired. Love, grief, and pain, they are all intertwined. And once you begin this journey, there is no turning back." Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His heart pounded in his chest. Something in the man's words resonated with him. Something deep inside him recognized the darkness that had taken root in his soul. But he had to know. He had to understand. As the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving Elias alone in the dimly lit room, the last words echoed in his mind. "Once you begin this journey, there is no turning back." The rain continued to fall outside, but Elias felt a strange chill in the air. The storm had only just begun. Elias stood frozen in the middle of his studio, the shadow seeming to press in on him. The man, or whatever he was, had vanished as suddenly as he appeared, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of his cryptic words. It was as if the very air had thickened with some kind of malevolent presence. His breath was shallow, his heart racing, and yet, despite the fear that clung to him, a strange curiosity began to take hold. What did the man mean? What truth was Elias about to uncover? For days, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. The encounter with the mysterious figure had opened a door in his mind, and now he felt compelled to walk through it. The grief he had been drowning in for years, the obsession that had gnawed at his every waking moment, suddenly seemed like something less human. It was as though the fabric of his reality was beginning to fray, the boundary between the living and the dead blurring. In the quiet of his studio, the weight of his thoughts pressed against him, pulling him deeper into the murk of his own mind. His paintings had begun to reflect this transformation, wild, chaotic, and unsettling. No longer were they landscapes of peace and beauty. They were jagged strokes of color that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, a violent undercurrent of emotion that threatened to spill over. His brush strokes grew erratic, frantic, as though his very soul was reaching out for something just beyond his grasp. Elias no longer slept. Instead, he would stay awake through the long, stormy nights, staring out the window at the torrential rain that lashed against the glass. It was as if he had become one with the storm, his mind as turbulent as the weather outside. The silence in the studio felt oppressive, but it wasn't the kind of silence one could escape from. It was the kind that gnawed at you, whispered to you, made you question whether you were truly alone. And then there were the dreams. At first, Elias had tried to dismiss them as mere figments of his overworked mind, the product of too much isolation and grief. But with each passing night, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. In these dreams, Alara was always there, her face partially obscured by shadows, her voice a haunting echo that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. She would speak to him, but the words were always just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like smoke. Her presence was always so close and yet so far, as if she were trapped in a place between life and death. One night Elias woke with a start, his heart hammering in his chest. He sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, the remnants of the dream still lingering in the dark corners of his mind. He glanced toward the window, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the rain outside, half shrouded in mist. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought he was still dreaming. But no, this was real. Elias sprang from his bed, rushing to the window, his eyes locked on the silhouette. It was impossible. No one could be standing out there in the storm, not in this downpour. And yet, there it was, someone or something, waiting just beyond the glass. Without thinking, Elias threw open the window, his heart pounding as the cold rain poured in. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the figure's face still hidden in shadow. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the figure spoke, the voice so faint and distant that Elias almost didn't hear it. "You are not alone." The words sent a chill through him, deeper than the cold rain. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend. The meaning behind them, what did it mean? He was alone, wasn't he? He had been alone since Alara disappeared, trapped in this empty existence, this world of shadows. And yet the figure outside seemed to suggest something different. Elias reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold glass of the window. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly lifted one hand, pointing toward the street, toward the distant horizon where the storm seemed to darken even further. The motion was deliberate, almost knowing. It was as if the figure was guiding him, beckoning him toward something he couldn't yet see. "Follow," the figure said, its voice barely a whisper. "The truth lies ahead." With that, the figure vanished, disappearing into the night, swallowed by the rain and mist. Elias stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. What had just happened? Was it a hallucination? A trick of his mind? Or had the figure truly been there, standing in the storm, waiting for him? The logical part of him screamed to dismiss it, to retreat back into the safety of his studio. But there was something else, something deeper inside him, a yearning, a need to know the truth that was impossible to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, whoever or whatever it was, had been guiding him toward something far darker than he could have imagined. The next morning, after little sleep and too much time spent wrestling with his thoughts, Elias decided to follow the figure's instructions. He put on his coat and stepped out into the storm, the cold rain biting at his skin. The town of Luria seemed different somehow, empty, like a place caught in some strange limbo between life and death. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the sound of the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. As he walked, Elias's mind raced. What was he searching for? The answer to the questions that had tormented him for years? Or something else entirely? The further he walked, the more the feeling of being watched crept over him. It was as though the very air was alive, holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. Finally, he reached the edge of town, where the familiar buildings gave way to a dark, wooded area. The storm had grown fiercer, the wind howling through the trees, but Elias felt an almost magnetic pull toward the woods. He couldn't explain it. It was as if the woods were calling to him, drawing him in, beckoning him toward whatever lay beyond. And then, at the edge of the trees, he saw it. A small, crumbling stone structure, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It was barely visible through the storm, but Elias could just make out the outline of a door that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, beckoning him. He took a step forward, then another, until he found himself standing before the door. His heart raced, his breath shallow, but he couldn't turn back now. Not after everything that had happened, not after all the signs that had led him here. With trembling hands, he reached out and touched the door. Cold, damp stone met his fingertips. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed the door open, the creak of old, wood echoing in the silence. What awaited him inside was a truth he could never have prepared for. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded like a death rattle, the dark interior of the stone structure stretching out before Elias like a cavern of forgotten memories. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and age-old decay. His breath caught in his throat, the oppressive silence almost suffocating. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the depths of the building, and the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Elias hesitated for a moment, standing on the threshold, staring into the darkness. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn back, to flee into the storm, back to the safety of his empty studio. But the pull, the insistent tug at his soul, was too strong to ignore. He had come this far, and there was no going back. Now! He stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a hollow thud that reverberated through the stone walls. The darkness enveloped him, swallowing him whole. He reached out, his hand trembling, and fumbled along the wall for a source of light. But there was nothing, no torch, no lantern. Only the oppressive blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly, in all directions. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt it. Something was watching him. Not just the sensation of being followed, but the feeling that something in this place was alive, aware of his every move. His mind began to race, his pulse quickening. Was it the storm outside playing tricks on him, or was there something truly inhuman lurking in the shadows? And then he saw it, a glint of something metallic in the dim light, faint but unmistakable, a mirror. It stood at the far end of the narrow corridor, framed in dark wood, its surface covered in grime and dust. The mirror was out of place here, like a relic from another world, an object of vanity in a place so forgotten by time. But there was something about it, something that called to Elias. He walked toward it, each step slow and cautious. His heart thudded in his chest and his breath quickened, as if the mirror was drawing him in, pulling him closer to whatever it held within. When he reached it, he stood in front of the glass, staring at his reflection, and for a moment he didn't recognize himself. The man in the mirror was not the Elias he had known. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt, drawn with the weight of years of grief and sleepless nights. His hair, once neat and well-kept, hung in matted strands around his face. He looked like a man who had been touched by madness, someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes of pain in a fraction of the time. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. The reflection in the mirror did not mirror his movements in the way it should have. At first, it was subtle, an extra twitch of his hand, a slight hesitation in his movements, but it soon became clear. The man in the mirror was not mimicking him. Instead, the reflection seemed to act on its own, as though it had a life of its own. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he stared in horror. His reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the cold glass. Elias did the same, his hand trembling as it met the surface of the mirror. But then something changed. The reflection in the glass twisted into a dark, malicious grin, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce right through him. "No," Elias whispered, his voice shaking. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the reflection in the mirror did not stop. It was smiling at him now, an expression that was far too wide, far too unnerving. And then the reflection's lips parted, and it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here, Elias," it said, its voice low and mocking, a perfect imitation of his own voice but twisted into something far darker. "This place, this is where it all begins." Elias recoiled, stumbling backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind was reeling, unable to process what was happening. The reflection in the mirror laughed, a soft, haunting chuckle that sent a cold shiver through his entire body. "This is not the end of your journey," it continued, its voice growing more sinister with each word. "This is where the truth is revealed, where the lies unravel, where love becomes destruction. And you, Elias, are the key." Elias backed away from the mirror, his legs unsteady, his mind racing. He didn't understand. What was it trying to tell him? What truth was it referring to? And why did it feel so real? He turned to flee, but before he could take another step, the mirror seemed to pulse with a sickly light. The reflection's grin widened, and Elias felt a sudden, unbearable pressure in his chest, as if the very air around him was closing in, suffocating him. "Don't run, Elias," the reflection called, its voice now a booming, omnipresent echo that filled the room. "You can't escape what you are." Elias's heart pounded in his ears, his breath shallow and erratic. His mind spun in circles, the edges of reality blurring. He wanted to scream, to break free from whatever nightmare had taken hold of him, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the mirror had ensnared him in its gaze, trapping him in a loop of fear and confusion, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure vanished. The mirror's glow faded, and the oppressive voice fell silent. Elias stood there, trembling, staring at his reflection. It was no longer twisted or distorted. It was just him again, but the sense of unease remained. Something had changed. He couldn't explain it. He didn't know what had just happened. But in that moment, Elias felt a deep, gnawing certainty. He was no longer alone. Whatever this place was, whatever force had led him here, it had found him. And it wasn't going to let him leave. His hands shaking, Elias turned away from the mirror, his breath ragged. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of here. But before he could move, a voice, soft and distant, whispered in his mind, "Follow the path. The answers are waiting." The voice was not his own. It was something else, something older, darker, and more powerful. He had no choice but to listen. Elias took a deep breath and turned toward the narrow passage ahead, the path now clearer, in his mind. The storm outside raged louder, but inside there was only the oppressive silence of what lay ahead. With no other choice, Elias took his first step. The darkness seemed to wrap itself around Elias like a shroud as he moved deeper into the stone structure, the only sounds now the soft echo of his footsteps and the distant rumble of thunder. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the cold, dampness seeped into his bones, making each step feel heavier than the last. His mind was still reeling from the encounter with the mirror, the twisted reflection that had spoken with such malicious clarity. It was as though his entire reality was shifting, breaking apart at the seams, and he could do nothing but follow wherever it led. The corridor before him stretched on endlessly, the stone walls narrowing as he walked, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. His eyes strained against the inky blackness, but there was no sign of light, no guiding hand to help him find his way. He felt like a moth drawn toward an unseen flame that promised both destruction and revelation. And yet, despite the growing terror inside him, Elias couldn't bring himself to stop. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him, something deep and primal, kept urging him forward. The passage twisted, looping back on itself as if the building were alive and shifting, testing him, toying with him. His mind was beginning to fragment, 1,000 thoughts colliding with each other, none of them making sense. There was only one constant, Ilara. Her face, her voice, haunted him. It was as though she were calling to him, drawing him into the depths of this place, this nightmare. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, he saw it. At the end of the passage there was a doorway, a dark wooden door that seemed almost too ordinary for this place of madness. It stood there, waiting, as if it had been waiting, for him all along. The moment Elias laid his eyes on it, he knew it was where he was meant to go. It felt like a destination, not a mere stopping point along the way. His hand reached for the door, trembling with a mix of anticipation and dread. The handle was cold, slick with moisture, and when he turned it, the door opened with an unsettling creak. Beyond it lay a vast, open chamber. The room was lit only by the pale flicker of candles, their flames dancing in the heavy air. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and markings, etched into the stone as though by ancient hands. The floor was littered with old yellowed pages, scraps of torn paper, as if they had been discarded long ago by some forgotten figure. In The center of the room stood a tall, black pedestal, its surface gleaming in the candlelight. Atop it, there was something that sent a chill down Elias's spine. A book, a thick, leather-bound tome, its cover worn and weathered, but unmistakable in its presence. He could feel its weight even from a distance, a pull, like gravity, drawing him toward it. Without thinking, he crossed the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place before it swallowed him whole, but his body betrayed him. His hand reached out, trembling, and as he touched the book, a cold surge of energy shot through him, sending a shock wave of electricity up his spine. The pages of the book flipped open on their own, as though some unseen force was guiding them. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, but the letters seemed to dance before his eyes, shifting and warping, becoming clearer with every passing second. The words seemed to beckon him, whispering things he couldn't quite understand, yet could feel in the deepest corners of his soul. And then the whispers became voices. At first, they were faint, soft murmurs, just beyond the reach of his comprehension. But soon they grew louder, clearer, until they filled the room, reverberating off the stone walls like a choir of the damned. "Elias," they whispered, their voices familiar and foreign all at once. "You've come so far. The end is near." The room seemed to tilt, as if the very ground beneath him were shifting. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and twisted like serpents in the dark. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He tried to pull away from the book, but his fingers wouldn't budge. The book was drawing him in, holding him in place, as if it were an extension of himself, a mirror to his own fractured psyche. Elias muttered, his voice thick with fear. "What is this?" The room seemed to respond, the air growing heavier with each passing moment, and then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness like a ghost from the past. Elias froze. It was her. Elias, her face, pale and gaunt, appeared in the flickering candlelight, her eyes hollow, her expression unreadable. She stood before him, silent and still, as if she were waiting for something. The same figure he had dreamed of so many times, the same voice he had heard in his mind. "Elias," Elias breathed, his voice shaking. How are you here?" But she did not respond. Instead, she took a step toward him, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. Her lips parted, but it was not her voice that came from her mouth. The same voices that had whispered to him from the book now spoke from her. "You've come to the truth, Elias," they said, her lips moving in sync with the words. "But it is not the truth you think it is." Elias recoiled, his chest tightening with fear. The room seemed to spin around him, the walls closing in as the voices grew louder, louder, until they drowned out everything else. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The love you sought," the voices said, "is what brought you here. But love, Elias, is a weapon. It will destroy you, as it has destroyed so many before you." Suddenly, the chamber was no longer just a room. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows shifted, becoming alive, stretching toward him like long, twisted fingers. The book in his hands grew heavier, its pages flipping violently as if caught in the wind. But there was no wind, only the suffocating weight of the voices, the suffocating weight of everything that had led him to this point. Elias whispered, but the figure before him began to change. The pale, haunted woman dissolved into a dark, shadowy shape, her features no longer clear. Her eyes, once full of sorrow, were now dark pits of malice. The room felt alive, and with every passing second, Elias could feel his sanity slipping away. The truth was slipping away, too, like sand through his fingers. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. The truth, he realized, wasn't what he thought it was. It wasn't love. It was something darker, something that had been lurking inside him all along. It was madness. The ground beneath Elias's feet seemed to shift, as though the very foundation of the chamber was crumbling away. The shadows that had once seemed like mere figments now writhed and coiled like serpents, twisting into grotesque forms that stretched and contorted in the flickering candlelight. The book in his hands had become an anchor, its pages now feeling like lead, pulling him down into the depths of some unfathomable abyss. Ilara's figure had vanished, replaced by a darkness so absolute it seemed to suffocate him. The whispers had taken on a mocking tone, their words no longer soft and gentle, but filled with venom. Elias could hear them now, echoing in his mind, resonating in his very bones, and he could no longer tell where they were coming from, whether they were the product of his own mind or something far more sinister. "You've come so far," they jeered. "But you still don't understand, do you? Love isn't the key, it never was." The walls of the room seemed to press in on him, growing tighter, with every passing moment. Elias's breath grew shallow as his mind raced, the overwhelming feeling of claustrophobia closing in on him. He tried to speak, to protest, but his words caught in his throat, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded him. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question barely escaping his lips. "What do you want from me?" The shadows answered, with laughter, cold, hollow, and dissonant. It was as if the room itself had become a living entity, mocking him with its cruel indifference. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Elias's breath came out invisible, puffs, as though he were standing in the heart of a frozen wasteland. His skin prickled with the sudden chill, and he could feel the numbness creeping up his limbs, slowly paralyzing him. "You're already too far gone," the voices hissed. "There is no escape. There never was." Desperation surged through Elias as he tried to pull away from the book, his fingers clenching around it with all his remaining strength. But it wouldn't let go. It had him now. He could feel it, the weight of it, sinking deeper into his soul. The pages continued to turn of their own accord, faster and faster, as if the book were searching for something it had to show him. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment he thought he saw Ilara again, standing at the edge of the room, her face twisted in sorrow and pity. Her eyes locked onto his, and she mouthed a single word, one that he couldn't quite hear but understood in his bones. "Run." But before he could react, the world around him shifted violently, the shadows swallowing Ilara whole, pulling her into their inky embrace. Elias reached out instinctively, but it was too late. She was gone, lost to the void. "There's no running." "From the truth," the voices said, now filling the room completely. "You cannot outrun your own heart." Elias collapsed to his knees, the book slipping from his hands and crashing to the ground. His mind was spiraling, torn between the suffocating weight of the darkness around him and the faint remnants of his sanity that still clung to him like the last threads of a shattered rope. The walls seemed to pulse now, breathing in time with his panicked heartbeat. The stone began to crack, and from the fractures a faint red light started to leak out, casting a sickly glow across the room. The light was warm, almost inviting, but it sent a shudder down Elias's spine, an instinctive warning that this was no ordinary light. This was the light of something ancient, something evil. In a moment of clarity, Elias understood. He had been chasing shadows his entire life, chasing love, chasing Ilara, chasing the idea of redemption. But the truth, the real truth, was far, darker than he could have ever imagined. The room, the darkness, the voices, they were not just figments of his imagination. They were a manifestation of something far deeper, something rooted in the very core of his being. This place was a reflection of his own fractured psyche, and the more he tried to escape, the more it consumed him. The book. It had been the key, all along, but not in the way he had hoped. It was a trap. As he stood trembling, unable to tear his eyes away from the glowing red light now pouring from the walls, Elias realized the horrifying truth. The path he had taken, The love he had pursued had led him here to this moment. He had been searching for something to heal him, to make him whole again, but what he had found was far worse. There was no healing. There was only madness. With a sickening clarity, Elias understood that he could never escape this place. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. The darkness was not something external, it was inside him. The voices, the shadows, the torment, everything that had led him here had been a manifestation of his own guilt, his own pain, his own fractured mind. He had become the killer of his own sanity. A sudden rush of cold hit him like a wave, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His vision swam, his thoughts becoming muddled and indistinct. His mind was slipping away, piece by piece, like sand falling through an open hand. And then, through the swirling haze of his deteriorating thoughts, one last, haunting whisper reached his ears. "Love is a weapon," it said, and now it has claimed. The darkness consumed him, and Elias was no more. The world around Elias dissolved into an inky blackness, leaving no trace of the room, the book, or the shadows that had once haunted him. For a moment there was nothing, only the suffocating silence that filled the void. His mind, shattered and broken, drifted aimlessly like a leaf caught in a storm, unsure of where it was or where it was supposed to go. It felt as though time itself had ceased to exist, as if the very concept of existence had unraveled completely. But then, like a distant echo from a forgotten memory, a voice emerged. "Elias." The voice was soft, fragile, but it carried with it a weight of familiarity mixed with a sense of deep sorrow. It reached through the darkness, pulling at the very edges of his consciousness, calling him back from the abyss. The voice, he knew it. It was hers, Ilara. "Elias, you are still here. You're still trapped." The words floated toward him, their meaning sinking in slowly, like a tide creeping over a rocky shore. He tried to speak, to reach out, but his body was not his own. He could feel nothing, no warmth, no cold, no sensation at all. He was a mere fragment, a disembodied thought, adrift in the void. And yet, despite the absence of any physical form, he could hear her, feel her presence in the space between his fractured thoughts. "Why did you come here, Elias?" Ilara's voice whispered. "Why did you have to follow me? Why couldn't you just leave it all behind?" Her words were a lash, cutting through the fog of his mind with a precision that felt almost deliberate. They were accusations, heavy with regret, as though she were reproaching him for something long past, something he couldn't quite remember. Elias tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His thoughts were swirling, fragmented pieces of a broken puzzle, each one a reflection of a different moment, a different choice. He could see flashes of memories, of her face, of their time together, of the love he had once believed in with all his heart. But those memories were fading, becoming hazy, distorted by the weight of his own unraveling mind. "You always believed that love could save you," Ilara's voice continued now, laced with bitterness. "You thought it was the answer to everything. But love is what brought you here. It is what destroyed you. And now it has taken everything." The darkness around him began to shift again, not in the shape of a room or a figure, but in something far more abstract, an overwhelming sense of loss, of something once cherished, now gone, lost forever in the chasm of his mind. The emotions he had buried deep inside, grief, guilt, shame, surfaced with an intensity that threatened to drown him. He could feel the weight of it all pressing in on him, suffocating him, as if the air itself had turned to lead. "You killed me, Elias," Ilara's voice said, growing louder, sharper. "You killed us. It was never supposed to end like this, but you wanted it, didn't you? You wanted to destroy everything, to bury the truth, and now you have nothing." Her words struck him like a physical blow, and for the first time since he had entered this nightmarish world, Elias felt something, pain, a sharp, burning pain that spread from his chest and shot through every nerve, every thought. It was as if the very fabric of his soul had been torn apart. "You couldn't save me," Alara whispered, her voice now soft again, almost tender. "You couldn't even save yourself." Elias clutched his chest, feeling the phantom pain of a heart that no longer beat. The weight of her words, of the guilt that had been buried for so long, came crashing down on him, drowning him in a sea of his own making. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The memories flooded back, each one a dagger lodged deep in his psyche. The moments of joy, of love, of fleeting happiness, each one had been a lie. They had all been bound by a single thread, a thread of obsession, of desperation, of a love that had never been pure. It was a love tainted by darkness, by the need to possess, to control, to claim. And in the end, that love had consumed everything, leaving only ruin in its wake. His mind spun, racing through the moments of his past, the late-night conversations with Alara, their shared dreams, the promises they had made to one another. But those memories, once so vivid, now felt like distant echoes, their warmth long since turned to cold ash. "You thought I was the answer," Ilara's voice said, now a faint whisper, "but I was just a reflection of your own need. Your love for me was never real. It was an illusion, a mask you wore to hide from the truth. And the truth, Elias, is that you were never whole. Not then, not now. You've always been broken." The void around him seemed to stretch further, pulling him deeper into its depths. The weight of his failure, his sins, pressed down on him, suffocating him as the darkness closed in. And in that final crushing moment, Elias realized that the love he had once chased, the love that had once seemed like salvation, had been nothing but a chain, binding him to a never-ending cycle of torment and regret. There was no escape from this place, no redemption, no second chance. And as the darkness consumed him completely, Elias understood the final truth. It was not love that had brought him here. It was his own heart, his own madness, that had led him to this inevitable end. Elias's mind had fully dissolved into the void, his body now an empty shell, drifting in a sea of memories and regrets. He had become a mere whisper, a fleeting echo in a universe that no longer cared about his existence. The world he had known, the love he had once believed in, was now nothing more than a fading illusion, a story lost to time. But even in the endless darkness, one thing remained, the weight of his regret. It was a sensation, familiar yet foreign, that clung to him with every passing moment, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. His thoughts, once sharp and clear, had become a blur of incoherent fragments, each piece a shard of the past that he couldn't seem to put together. The pieces were scattered, lost in the chasm of his own despair, and yet, through the darkness, a voice called to him again, "Elias?" It was soft, like a distant breeze, yet it seemed to reverberate deep within him, vibrating in the hollow space where his soul once resided. He tried to turn toward it, to reach for it, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. His body no longer obeyed his will, and his thoughts were scattered like the broken pieces of a shattered mirror. But still, the voice persisted, calling to him, pulling him from the abyss. "Ilara?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper in the emptiness. The name felt foreign on his tongue, as if he hadn't spoken it in centuries. "Is it really you?" the voice responded, not with words but with an image, faint at first but growing clearer with every passing second. Ilara, her face, her eyes, her form, all began to materialize in the darkness, like a ghost rising from the depths of his fractured mind. But something was wrong. The image of her was distorted, warped. Her features, once soft and full of life, were now hollow, her expression twisted in anguish. Her eyes, once bright with warmth, were now cold and empty, staring at him with a mixture of sorrow and contempt. "Elias," she said, her voice no longer the soft, comforting tone he had once known, "you've been a fool. You still don't understand, do you?" This was never about love. It was about control, about power, about your need to possess. He recoiled from the apparition, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt as though her words were sinking into him, tearing through the remnants of his mind, revealing the truth he had always known but had refused to face. He had spent so long chasing her, believing that love could redeem him, believing that his obsession with her could fill the emptiness inside him. But all of it, everything he had believed in, had been a lie. "You were never mine to control," Ilara's voice continued, growing more distant, as if she were slipping away once more. "You couldn't even control yourself. And now, look at what you've become." The image of her flickered, fading in and out like a dying flame, and Elias could feel himself being drawn back into the darkness, back into the crushing weight of his own guilt. He wanted to reach out to her, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but he couldn't move, he couldn't escape. He was trapped in this endless cycle of self-doubt, consumed by the very emotions that had led him to this place. "You wanted to save me," Ilara's voice said, distant and cold. "But you couldn't even save yourself." Her words echoed in his mind, reverberating through every corner of his consciousness. She was right. He had never been whole. He had always been broken, searching for something to fill the void within him, but everything he had sought had only deepened that emptiness. The darkness around him began to shift, slowly at first, like the first hint of dawn breaking through the night. But instead of light, it was more shadows, twisting and distorting, becoming even darker, more oppressive. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very fabric of reality were bending around him. The void was not empty. It was full of everything he had ever feared, everything he had ever lost. His thoughts spiraled, memories flashing before his eyes like a montage of failures and regrets. The first time he had met Ilara, the way her smile had lit up his world, the way she had looked at him with such warmth, such tenderness, and how he had felt for the first time in his life that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so broken after all. But that had been a lie, too. The truth was that he had always been broken. He had always been searching for something, someone, to fix him, to save him. But no one could save him, not even Ilara. And now, as he sank deeper into the abyss, he understood that the real darkness had never been the shadows around him, but the one that had been inside him all along. "You never loved me," Ilara whispered, her voice now barely audible, as if she were being swallowed by the void. "You loved only what you wanted me to be." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him, leaving him breathless. In the suffocating emptiness, he tried to scream, to cry out, but there was nothing left. His mind was gone. His body was gone. He was nothing more than a collection of memories, regrets, and broken promises, floating aimlessly in a universe that had forgotten his name. And as the last remnants of his sanity slipped away, Elias finally understood. Love, in all its forms, had never been his salvation. It had been his prison. And now, as he drifted further into the abyss, he knew that he would never escape it. Not in this life, not in the next, never again. Elias's mind, a tattered remnant of his former self, had become nothing more than a fragile thread stretched thin by the weight of the darkness. He was lost, utterly lost, adrift in the void, surrounded by his own fractured thoughts. There was no sense of time, no sense of space. Only the suffocating silence pressing in from all sides and the remnants of Ilara's voice, echoing faintly in the distance. The darkness had become an entity in itself, an oppressive force that clung to him, seeping into every crevice of his fractured soul. He could no longer distinguish where the void ended and where he began. The line between his own consciousness and the consuming nothingness had blurred beyond recognition. He was no longer a person. He was an idea, a manifestation of despair, a ghost trapped in an endless loop of regret. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker at the edge of his perception. A fleeting moment, a whisper of light in the distance. But it wasn't the kind of light that would guide him out of the darkness. No, this was a different kind of light, cold, sterile, and unforgiving. It felt as though it was calling to him, beckoning him towards something he didn't want to understand. He tried to turn away, but the light was relentless, growing brighter with every passing second. It surrounded him, cutting through the shadows, like a blade, carving a path toward an unknown destination. Elias resisted, but his body, what was left of it, moved of its own accord, drawn toward the light as if it had a mind of its own. "Do you think you can escape?" the voice of Alara whispered from the shadows, still distant but unmistakably present. "There is no escape from yourself, Elias. You cannot run from the truth." Her words cut through the fog of his thoughts, sinking deep into the marrow of his being. She was right. He couldn't escape. There was no running, no hiding from the darkness within him. It was a part of him now, woven into the very fabric of his existence. And as the light grew brighter, he felt the weight of that truth pressing in on him, crushing him with a force he couldn't resist. The light had become blinding, suffocating, and Elias felt himself being pulled into it, his consciousness stretching and distorting as if it were being torn apart by the sheer intensity of its presence. He tried to scream, to fight back, but there was nothing left, no voice, no body, just the overwhelming sensation of falling into something vast and empty. And then, as if in response to his desperation, a figure appeared in the light. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a face that seemed both familiar and foreign. His eyes, cold, empty, and devoid of any emotion, stared at Elias with an intensity that made him feel small, insignificant. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to freeze Elias in place, to hold him captive. In the suffocating light, "You've been chasing shadows, Elias," the man said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "Chasing something you can never have. Love, redemption, control, all illusions." Elias tried to move, to escape, but his limbs were frozen, his body trapped in the paralyzing grip of the light. The man's gaze never wavered, and his words cut through the air like a blade. "You were never meant to be saved," the man continued. "You were meant to learn the truth about yourself, about what you really are." Elias's mind reeled, spinning with confusion, fear, and the crushing weight of the man's words. He had been searching for something, for someone, his entire life. But now, in the face of this overwhelming presence, he understood. It wasn't love that he had been seeking. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even freedom. He had been searching for a way to escape himself. The man stepped forward, his figure towering over Elias, and placed a cold hand on his shoulder. Elias shuddered, feeling the chill seep through his very soul. The man's touch was like ice, numbing him, draining him of whatever was left of his will to fight. "It's too late for you, Elias," the man said, his voice a mixture of pity and contempt. "You've already become what you feared most, a killer, a destroyer, not of others, but of yourself." Elias tried to speak, to deny the words, but no sound came from his throat. His thoughts were swirling, crashing into one, another like waves against a jagged rock. The man's words were sinking into him, tearing apart the last remnants of his resistance. "You have always been broken, Elias," the man continued, his voice now a low, echoing hum. "You were never capable of love, not in the way you thought. You were only capable of consuming, of destroying everything you touched." The man's grip tightened on Elias's shoulder, and in that moment the truth became unbearable. Elias had been the one to destroy everything. His obsession with Alara, his need to control, to possess, to make her his, those were the things that had led him to this moment. Not love, not redemption, only the darkness within him, the hunger to consume and control, to bend everything to his will. And in his pursuit of that, he had killed everything that was pure within himself. The man released him, stepping back into the light. His form began to fade, dissolving into the blinding brightness that consumed everything. And as Elias stood there, frozen in place, the light began to burn away the last remnants of his identity, his sense of self. He had never been whole. He had always been broken. The light grew blinding, filling every corner of his fractured mind, until there was nothing left, only the darkness. In the relentless flood of light, Elias felt himself slipping further away from the faint traces of his own existence. There was no body left to hold him, no memories left to anchor him. The very essence of his being was being undone, erased by the light that surrounded him. It was as though everything that had ever defined him, the love, the pain, the madness, was being stripped away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left. No thoughts, no feelings, no Elias. And yet, even in that overwhelming emptiness, there was a presence. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the edge of his consciousness, but it grew louder, stronger, as if calling him back from the abyss. The voice, familiar and haunting, pierced the overwhelming silence. Elias, it was Alara's voice, but it wasn't the same voice he had heard before. This voice was softer, gentler, as though the bitterness that had once marked her words had been washed away by something purer. It was as if she had returned to him, not as the figure of condemnation she had once been, but as something else, something lost, something fragile. "Please," the voice pleaded, "don't let this be the end." Elias wanted to respond, wanted to reach out to her, but he couldn't. His body had ceased to exist, his mind fractured beyond recognition. All he could do was listen, feel the pull of her voice, so full of sorrow and longing, guiding him through the vast, empty void. "Elias, remember," the voice whispered. "Remember who you were. Remember what we were. You can't let it all slip away." The words seemed to reverberate within him, as though they were awakening something that had long been buried. The memories, those fleeting, broken memories, began to surface, rising up from the depths of his mind like fragments of a shattered glass. He could see her again, her face, her eyes, the way she had looked at him with such tenderness, the love that had once bound them together, but the memories weren't enough to keep him from drowning in the darkness. They were nothing but echoes, fading quickly into the void, leaving him with only a sense of yearning, a yearning for something he couldn't grasp, something that had been lost forever. "Elias," the voice called again, its tone filled with desperation. "It's not too late. You can still choose." The choice. The word hung in the air like a lifeline, offering him a glimmer of hope. But what choice did he have left? The man in the light had told him the truth. He had always been broken. He had always been incapable of love, incapable of salvation. What was left to choose? Was there even a possibility of redemption? Or had his fate already been sealed? "Don't give up," Ilara's voice pleaded once more, now filled with a raw, aching emotion. "You have to fight. You can still fight." Her words struck him deep within, resonating in the very core of his being. He didn't know how, but he felt something stir within him, a faint glimmer, a spark of resistance. The darkness had taken so much from him, and yet this voice, this plea from Ilara, seemed to stir something deep inside him. It wasn't love. It wasn't redemption. It was the simple, raw desire to not let everything fade into nothingness. He had never been a hero. He had never been pure, but he was still here. And for the first time, Elias understood that the choice wasn't about saving himself or finding a way back to what he had once been. It was about accepting the truth, that he was flawed, that he was broken, but still choosing to fight, to not let the darkness consume him completely. The light, the cold, unforgiving light, began to shift, its blinding brilliance fading just slightly as the presence of Alara's voice grew stronger. The shadows that had once swallowed him seemed to recede, pulled back by some unseen force, as though the very fabric of reality was bending around him. Elias took a breath. No, not a breath, for he had no body to breathe with. But the sensation of it, the feeling of air filling his lungs, was enough to bring a flicker of awareness back to him. He wasn't lost. Not completely. Not yet. "You are not alone, Elias," Ilara whispered, her voice now a soft lullaby, as though she were right beside him, holding him in the warmth of her embrace. "I am with you, always." The words were a balm, soothing the raw, jagged edges of his consciousness, and for the briefest of moments, Elias felt whole again. Whole in a way he hadn't felt in so long. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't saved. But he wasn't lost anymore, either. The light dimmed further, and the darkness that had once consumed him began to lose its grip. The presence of Ilara, however intangible, was enough to pierce the veil, to remind him that despite everything, despite the mistakes, the obsessions, the destruction, there was still something worth fighting for, a part of him, a part of them. But the path forward wasn't clear. There was no easy redemption. There would be no simple answers, only the fight to continue, to choose something other than the despair that had once defined him. As the last remnants of the overwhelming light faded into the distance, Elias was left standing in the space between the darkness and the fading echoes of Ilara's voice. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was ready to face it, and whatever it was, he would face it alone. Elias stood in the liminal space, suspended between the darkness that threatened to consume him and the faint ethereal glow of Ilara's voice. The stillness around him was suffocating, yet there was something oddly peaceful about it. It was as if he were no longer part of the world he had known, no longer bound by the rules of the living. The light had faded, leaving only shadows, and the soft whisper of her voice in the distance. He could feel the weight of his decisions pressing in. On him, the years of chasing something unattainable, of grasping at the fleeting remnants of love and control, now finally coming to fruition. It wasn't a redemption he had earned, but a hard truth he could no longer escape. He wasn't the hero of his own story. He wasn't the one to save anyone, not even himself. But in this quiet moment of reckoning, he was at least allowed to see it, to accept it. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, as if it had its own heartbeat, echoing in rhythm with his thoughts. He had come to understand that the greatest prison was not the one built by others, but the one created by his own mind, the obsessive need to control, the endless yearning for something that could never be his, the guilt that gnawed at his soul, unrelenting and cruel. "Elias," the voice called again, gentle now, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Ilara's voice, a balm to his fractured psyche, but still distant, intangible. "You have to let go, let go." The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his life, Elias wasn't sure if they meant to let go of everything, his past, his pain, his obsession, or if it meant something darker. To let go of himself, to surrender completely to the abyss that had nearly consumed him. He stood still, the choice before him, not clear, but present. Let go and risk being swallowed whole by the emptiness that had been his companion for so long, or hold on, cling to whatever was left of him, and face the inevitable fallout of his actions. Either way, there was no going back. The past was irretrievable, the present was slipping away, and the future? It was an uncertain, hazy dream he would never reach. "You've been running from yourself," Ilara's voice whispered, now fading as if she were a memory slipping from his grasp. "Running from the truth, from your choices, from the very core of who you are." Her words struck him with a finality he had been avoiding. There was no more running, no more chasing, no more searching for something or someone to fix him. He had destroyed everything in his path, the love he had once believed in, the redemption he had sought so desperately. It was all gone, and now it was time to face the truth of what he had become. Elias closed his eyes, letting the weight of the silence wash over him, the oppressive emptiness that had been his companion for so long. He wanted to scream, to rage against it all, to claw his way back to the life he had once imagined for himself. But there was no point. The chains were gone, the walls had crumbled, he was free. And yet, in that freedom, he felt only loss. The kind of loss that stripped him bare, leaving him with nothing but the stark realization that he was alone, more alone than he had ever been before. His heart, a hollow echo of what it once was, ached with the weight of 1,000 broken dreams. He had loved once, and it had destroyed him. He took a step forward, not sure where he was going, or if it even mattered. The shadows around him seemed to part, as if allowing him to move freely, but there was no destination, no path to follow, just the emptiness. For the first time, he understood the horror of being alone. It wasn't the absence of people, of relationships, of love. It was the absence of meaning, of purpose. The realization that his entire existence had been spent searching for something that wasn't there. And now, in the quiet aftermath, he could see it, the final, hollow victory. He had reached the end, but it wasn't a beginning. It was a nothingness, a finality that didn't care about redemption or forgiveness. The story of Elias had been written, and it had been nothing more than a tragic tale of self-destruction. There was no salvation, no hero's journey, no grand finale. Just the echo of his name, lost in the void. And in the end, that was the most tragic truth of all.